It's really good to be here talking to a sector that fortunately or unfortunately hasn't had to deal with the complex economic regulatory debates, but it sounds like it's certainly being talked about, and it's I think pretty timely for me to give at least a basic overview of what economic regulation is, as opposed to what it's famous for, because certainly I think a lot of the economic regulation debates, particularly in electricity and gas, play out in the public domain, and I think if that's your main introduction to what economic regulation is, you might be scratching your head and thinking, well, how does it apply to me in the water sector? So I'll try and shed some light on that. The other thing that I wanted to also talk about was how economic regulation actually fits in with the other options that government has in terms of interventions. Because primarily economic regulation, or any type of regulation, is actually an intervention to try and make sure something happens that isn't happening but needs to, or something, or stop something from happening that shouldn't be happening. And regulation is not always the right answer for that. I'll also talk a bit about why, out of the different tools that are available to government, why they might choose economic regulation as opposed to something else out of the suite of tools that they have. And then give you a brief introduction into the mechanics of it. So how does it actually work? Because there are lots of models, there are lots of approaches, there are lots of reasons why you might choose to do it, but at the end of the day, there's pretty much one formula that's been around for 20 years, and people get more or less sophisticated with it. But the real core of it is actually fairly straightforward and fairly constant over the last few decades at least. Then I'll talk a little bit about what we can learn from the New Zealand regulatory debate in other sectors, but also some relevant things from overseas. And then leave you with some questions about, at least the questions I think the industry should be asking itself, and also that individual utilities may want to ask themselves as they kind of think through this debate. So what is this based? Really, it's just a tool, right? It's just one tool that government can use. It's one of a suite of tools, and I'll talk about kind of the different tools shortly. But really, fundamentally, what it actually aims to do is to keep utility revenues more or less in line with the reasonable costs of providing the service. So it's a matching mechanism. Jumping a bit ahead, often what it's famous for is saying prices or revenues are too high, we need to bring them down. That's certainly one part of what it does, but it's not necessarily the main or the most relevant part of it. It's really about matching costs and revenues and making sure that you really understand the costs and why they are what they are, and that they're appropriate, and then that you've got the right amount of revenue to fund those costs. So the practical effect of that intervention and the value that it provides can actually be quite different depending on the specific circumstances where you're applying. So, I've given an example of kind of four typical problems at a high level that people tend to use economic regulation for. So the obvious one is the one that I've just talked about. So you have an efficient utility, it's running things well, it's very profit motivated, and it's got the ability to charge prices beyond reasonable costs. So it does to try and extract additional profits. And in that case, the main value of the economic regulation tool is to just bring those revenues down more in line with what reasonable costs are. So that's pretty straightforward. You have there's a flip side to any coin. You can also have a situation where the utility is still efficient, but for whatever reason, and there are lots of reasons this can be, often they are political, but there are many other reasons. Even though it's efficient, it knows what its costs are, it can't actually set its revenues or tariffs to a level that allows it to recover those costs, and so it runs into problems. In that case, what an economic regulatory regime can do is to actually provide a neutral expert view from outside the utility, from outside of government, to verify and understand what the reasonable costs are, so to give customers in particular confidence, yes, this is what needs to be done, yes, this is how much it costs. and to then set revenues accordingly to ensure that the business is financially sustainable in the long term. So to me, that's just it's exactly the same mechanism, but it's driving a slightly different outcome or solving a slightly different problem. The other situation you sometimes have is where you have a utility that isn't efficient. So you can tell by looking at benchmarks and peers that it should be able to deliver high levels of service or at a lower level of cost. And at the same time, though, it's actually charging less than it should. It's not covering its actual costs, but its actual costs are incredibly high and should potentially be lower. So it's a mix of the different problems that we've got. So in that case, economic regulation can still help provide that neutral and independent view on what the reasonable costs are, set a path towards that, make sure that the revenues are set in accordance with that. And so what that does is, in addition to aligning things, it also actually creates incentives for the utility to become more efficient in the long term. And the final example there, which is kind of a little bit more of a detailed situation, very often you'll have, particularly when you don't have very sophisticated tariffs, you will have situations where overall revenues are covering the reasonable costs of providing the service, but some customers just can't afford it. So it costs a lot to provide rural services, it costs less to provide urban services. You might have cost-reflective pricing, but at the same time you realize that the actual cost of providing the service is so high that the customer doesn't want it. And that's not necessarily a good outcome. You might have reasons why you are happy to cross-subsidize them. In that case, what economic regulation does, it actually helps give transparency and explain, well, here are the gaps. Here's why those gaps are worth covering. Here's why we're going to cross-subsidize. Here's the outcomes that we want. And being very clear and transparent about it so that over time you may be able to remove it, we may be able to make it more efficient, but so that it's not kind of hidden in the detail and nobody really knows who's helping out who, how much. Because one thing that you find with economic regulation is the massive benefit of it is being able to clearly talk to customers and explain, here's what you're paying for, and here's what you're getting in return, and here's how we're making things better. Having that clear story and having that delivered not just by the utility or the utility's owner, but by somebody independent whose job it is to really understand what is going on and report to the customer, that gives it a credibility and the support of the outcomes that you just can't get if you're doing it through the utility itself or through the ownership structure. So, in terms of other potential interventions, there are, like I said, several tools that government can use to achieve the objectives that it has. One obvious tool is ownership. And so, just if you own the utility, you can pretty much tell it what to do, which on the face of it would seem a lot simpler than setting up a costly regulator, funding them, and having them enter into a potentially heated relationship with utilities. So often governments do just choose to do just that. The other option is the carrot option, where you really provide fiscal incentives, where you provide specific subsidies, you provide tax incentives directly from government to the utility, and you say, I want this and this and this, in return I will give you this funding, please make it happen. Can also be quite workable and does work in many places. If for whatever reason you can't or don't want to do that, then kind of economic regulation becomes the lever that you use. And we've heard about lots of different types of regulation today, so there is definitely an overlap. Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do as an economic regulator is to match costs and revenues, but for a particular service level. And defining the service level is something that often somebody else will do. So if you have a safety regulator and they define drinking water standards, the economic regulator is not going to second guess that. What they're going to do potentially is, the equivalent in Australia was when you have safety standards changing for electricity lines and you have all these businesses proposing to incur lots of costs to come up to scratch your nose. The economic regulator comes to the safety regulator and says, look, I know you've changed something, I don't really understand this stuff. These three companies are saying they need to do X, Y, and Z to be compliant. Are they pulling my leg? Do they really need to do all this stuff? How much of it do they really need to do? At that point, you can have a bit of cooperation, and the safety regulator will say, well, I can tell you about the scope of what they do and don't need to do. Can't really tell you anything about the cost because I'm not an economic regulator. But from that point, the economic regulator can pick things up and look at, okay, as long as I know that this is the right scope for them to do the work, what should it cost? And that's really the economic regulator's job. And so you have various overlaps with consumer protection regulation, with environmental regulation, because to a large extent, all of these things set a particular service level. If you want to have network coverage extended into a particular area where it wasn't compulsory before, but there aren't any funds, you kind of need to decide, do I really want to do that and is it worth the money? That may be a decision that the economic regulator makes, or it could be a decision that somebody else makes in government and directs, and then the economic regulator's job is to work out what should it cost. So with that in mind, why would you actually choose economic regulation rather than the other levers? As I mentioned before, what you hear about most are the big price debates. It's to do with monopoly abuse and a profit-maximizing monopoly of using its market power. I just want to emphasize that it often kind of people use monopoly as a dirty word. You know, a natural monopoly is not a good or a bad thing. It's kind of just a fact of life for some industries and for some sectors. If you have a situation where, because of you have high fixed costs, and because the bigger the business gets, the more efficiently it can deliver the service, it is a natural outcome of the economics and the commercial realities of the organization that it should be one service provider. That's the right thing to happen. There's nothing wrong with that. And so it's not a good or a bad thing. The potential bad thing that happens is if that company is privately owned and is focused on profit, and it has that sole supplier position, it can and it does sometimes choose to abuse that position, and it ends up getting regulated. So that's, and that is what economic regulation is famous for, although it's very unusual to see that position when the utility in question is owned by government or by customers themselves, because, well, there is a direct control there that generally tries to keep prices in line. And so you have the other side of the coin. The other reason you might want to choose economic regulation is to do with the service levels. And the service levels, that can mean simply getting a connection within a reasonable time, or at all, being able to connect, or having your query complaint resolved, in a reasonable and timely way, or just knowing that, the service is going to regularly meet a quality standard, whether it's for power quality or for the quality of the water. And once again, because cost levels are driven by whatever service level you are actually aiming for a profit maximizing utility, a simple way to try and make money is to keep the prices what they are, if they're not allowed to increase them, but then to erode service quality. And so in that case, the regulator's job is to try to make sure that it monitors the quality, and if the quality is reduced, it penalizes the revenues that the company can earn. Then again, another problem that you commonly have is utilities that, because they are constrained on the price side, and because they want to keep prices low, because it could be a requirement of their owner, and it's certainly, it happens across the board. In New South Wales recently, you had a situation where the government-owned utility said, I need a price increase because I need to, I need to meet certain standards, I need to improve reliability in certain areas. And the regulator said, yes, you do, here's the money. But the government owner then came in and said, no, you don't, I don't want prices going up, so you're not going to do any of this. So in those situations, the important function that the regulator fulfills is to actually clarify and promote the achievement of the right quality standards. And it is that ability to divert the kind of the heat away from potentially highly interested parties with their own specific agendas to an independent party that's simply tasked with making sure that consumers get a fair deal. And you'd be amazed how much that helps focus and diffuse the debate when you have somebody who's quite clearly on the customer side and doing their best for the customer. So how does it actually work? So this is the, So how does it actually work? This is what is referred to as the building blocks model, and it's kind of the formula that I was talking about that never really changes. What it does is it breaks down the costs, and I've simplified this to remove the tax component because otherwise it gets complicated. But really, what it does, it tries to estimate costs going forward. And it typically looks out over 3 to 5 years, some places shorter, some places longer. And it works out these costs over a 5-year period, works out the revenues required to cover these costs, and then smooths it, because if you're estimating it on an annual basis, your costs might be going up or down. You don't want to be putting your prices up or down, or yanking your revenues up or down every year. So it tends to be smoothed on a trajectory that's kind of upward or downward or flat, if you can keep it flat. The simple part of that equation is the operating and maintenance expenses. So that's what it costs you to run the business. A starting point is looking at what you actually spend. So a regulator looks at that and just make sure that you're correctly accounting for what you're spending. The next question that then asks is, well, is that what you should be spending? Are you being efficient? Can I benchmark you against peers? Can I have a look to see what exactly you're spending the money on? Is it lots of corporate retreats and strategy days and things like that, or is it actually service provision? And so it can disallow some costs, or it can include an efficiency adjustment that says, look, over time you should be able to just reduce your OPEX 2 or 3% a year, because most other industries can do that. I don't see why you shouldn't. But also, to the extent that there are service level changes, there can be increases incorporated into this. So just as they might be asking for reductions, they might say, yes, I can see you need a change there, or there's a specific new legislation that's come in that requires you to comply with certain things that will cost money. We will put that in on top of what your actual historic costs were. And so having gone through that process, what they establish is an allowable OPEX. And that goes into the formula. So it's one component, and essentially, because that's operating expenditure that you need to fund as you go, whatever they work out that OPEX level to be, that is funded through the tariffs or regulated revenues. Capital expenditure is a little bit different and a little bit more complicated. And so the way a regulator thinks about capital expenditure is to say, you're going to put something in the ground that will be there 40, 50, 60, 100 years. And you need to be able to get your capital back, so you need to be able to reinvest when that asset reaches the end of its useful life. But you also need to be able to fund it, so you need to get a return on that capital. And so having, sorry, how do I, there we go. I'm not sure if people can see that. So having having a set of existing assets that you start out with, and I'll come back to this later because it tends to be the most contentious part. How do you value the assets that you already have before regulation starts? So you have an asset base of existing assets with a particular value, and then you have new capital expenditure that goes in throughout the year. The way you actually get your revenue for that is to look at what is the depreciation over the year. So how is the asset, and it's trying to mirror the asset deteriorating over time as it reaches the end of its useful life. And it allows you to build up effectively a fund that you can spend to replace the asset when it's ready. Now you can bridge that through financing, or you can just kind of put the money to one side, which some utilities do. So that's this building block here, which basically takes the depreciation of the asset and says, I need to fund that through revenue. The other part of it is to say, the asset base that you have needs to be funded, and you need to earn a return on that. For a commercial utility, that's actually going to be a cost of capital that includes a cost of equity, because you're actually putting money in to make money, and so there will be a return on equity. For government-owned utilities, it tends to focus on the cost of funding. So what does it cost you to borrow the money to put the assets in the ground and fund them? So in terms of numbers, this can be as low as 4% or as high as 15%. And so what you get each year is a mix of your OPEX allowance, the depreciation of your assets, and then the targeted return on those assets, which you calculate by taking the asset base. So let's say you have a $1 billion asset base, and your targeted return is 10%. There will be a $100 million that will be provided as your return on capital, and whatever depreciation you have. So let's say you've got a very short asset life and your asset base of 10 years. Every year there'll be a $100 million depreciation allowance, so that by the time you get to the end of 10 years, you will have received back the $1 billion that you invested and the return on that, and you're able to reinvest. So what you then do is you bring all of those things together and you say, here are the revenues that I need as an organization to make sure I can fund the investment, that when the investment reaches the end of its useful life, I'm able to reinvest, and that I can actually cover the costs of running my business. So you get to this point, and then if you have tariffs, which I know in the water sector a lot of people don't, but if you have specific tariffs, there is then a pricing methodology that looks at the quantities that you're charging in your particular charging methodology and transfers that into tariffs to customers. But a lot of regulatory regimes just stop there and look at what are the actual revenues you require without even going to the tariff side of things. And so the key part of it is this bit has to match the sum of these three, and having an independent regulator scrutinize these three things gives you the confidence that this isn't too high or too low, and it really tells you what this amount should be. So some quick lessons from other sectors and jurisdictions. I think looking at the New Zealand regulatory experience is not massively useful to the people here today, because the New Zealand debate, which is really focused on electricity, gas, and to some extent airports, has been really focused on prices. And I think the one really useful thing to come out of that is in the electricity regime, when it was originally introduced, there was a large number of cooperative or consumer-owned distributors that were included in that regime. And over time, both the regulator and the government came to the conclusion that that wasn't particularly useful because these organizations do not have a profit motive. And so this whole regime that's focused around making sure there are no excessive profits, it really has no relevance to these particular distributors. And in the end, 7 years after introducing that regime, they took those distributors back out, and we did a lot of the work on that and making sure that we could explain why it wasn't necessary to impose all these regulatory costs on them. In the water sector, I guess the one important thing to note is when regulation is introduced, whether in developed or developing countries, so in the UK when Ofwat originally came into being, while there were efficiency improvements required and cost reductions are the things that the regulators sought, they also provided explicit uplifts of revenues to allow for utilities to get up to the mandatory standards that they weren't meeting at the time. So the regulator scrutinized that, looked at how much was required, and actually explicitly provided for it, which gave it kind of the independent backing. And in that case, there were net tariff increases in some instances. A similar thing happens in developing countries where you often have utilities that are not providing the service at all to any kind of decent standards. They're not connecting customers when they're asking for it. Giving them the funding, but also setting the quality standards and enforcing those standards can sometimes increase and result in substantial increases in revenues and tariffs. But in return for giving customers the service they've been crying out for and not being able to get. And so it ends up being a very positive outcome for the city and the country and the utility as well. So we've seen that Bogota in Colombia is a really good example of that, was being a complete turnaround of the utility. Another important thing to note is that halfway houses don't work. So the New Zealand regime in electricity started out as light-handed regulation, which was really trying to regulate without regulating. It was, we'll start regulating, we'll kind of threaten you, and if you're really bad, we'll then go to this formula that I put up before. It resulted in a lot of confusion. It resulted in a delay of investment as businesses tried to figure out what was going on. It resulted in customer-owned distributors saying, I don't understand how it applies to me. And so after a lot of toing and froing, 7 years later, they reformed the regime to be much more orthodox. And that just basically goes to show that the number one priority in economic regulation needs to be certainty, and you really don't want to tinker with the regime. Which means that, well, I know New Zealand likes to innovate. There are certain things that are best left to slow and incremental innovations, and I think this is one of those situations. But there's no reason why different governance models can't be used to apply the same formula. So the co-regulatory gas regime is once again something that we helped develop and set up. It's still using similar mechanisms to what a normal regulator would, even though it's not an economic regulator. But the governance is different and it's much more cooperative. Finally, another really important thing to note is the importance of the opening asset base. So when you're setting that first, amount, and it tends to be, I think Watercare said, $9 billion. The decision whether it's 9 billion, 7 billion, or 11 billion in the regulatory asset base for the purposes of setting the price has a massive impact on the revenues and the prices at a base launch level. And so when a private utility is involved, they do everything in their power to increase that amount because it's going to set the tone for the next 20, 30 years. When you have government-owned utilities, you still need to try and answer the question, what is the appropriate method for setting that asset base? But you can decouple that from, well, what are my investment needs and my OPEX needs going forward? Because I really need to be able to fund those. I'm less interested in trying to make money on this asset that I already have that was handed to me by the government. So one of the luxuries that government-owned utilities have is to really focus on the forward-looking rather than trying to make sure that they're protecting value for a shareholder on existing assets that are already in the ground and arguably have been paid for by the state. So finally, just some quick questions to leave you with. I think for the industry as a whole, the real question has to be, is economic regulation the right intervention? Because, New Zealand has been quite unique in making sure that whenever we introduce regulation, generally we actually do an inquiry to test, is it warranted? And it's normally quite a sophisticated piece of work to test all the pros and cons. It is an expensive tool. It is a tool that creates a lot of jobs, and not necessarily in a good way. I like to refer to economic consultants like myself as living in the dead weight loss triangle. We're there because somebody's being wasteful. We're trying to minimize the triangle that we're in, but it's also the area where we operate. You really should think hard before you create another one of those. Sometimes it's worth it, sometimes it's not. You need an economist to tell you which it is. But if this is something that is getting traction and something that is being looked at, I think the really important questions are, well, who and how would set the required service levels and what would they be? And I know there's a lot of work going on that. What is the method that you would use to set the opening asset base? The electricity and gas debates and the airports debates, 80% of the debate was about that, and the court cases and all that was about that. I think this industry is in a very different headspace, so there's probably a lot more opportunity for collaboration on how that should be done. And then for individual utilities, the kinds of things that you want to at least try and do a back of an envelope on is, what do I think my asset base is currently? How could I estimate it? Do I have a good story? So do I have an asset management and investment plan that actually tells a coherent story about how I'll meet the service levels that I think are required, what it will cost, and why it should cost that much and not less and not more, and why I'm doing the right scope of work? And you'd be amazed that the utilities that have been regulated for decades still find it really difficult to get that story straight internally and then to explain that externally to somebody like a regulator or even a board at times, believe it or not. So from there, you might want to do some comparisons, looking at your peers and seeing, are my costs higher or lower than my peers? Can I explain those differences? But most importantly, trying to run the basics of that formula and looking at, well, what is the sign on the gap, and how big is the gap between what I think my costs are going forward and what my revenues are? So I've seen a lot of things about, this is the amount of investment required going forward. But the timing of that investment, the structure of that investment in terms of how long the assets are, the OPEX implications of that, they're all very important. So you can do that forward-looking analysis and then compare it to your revenues or your expected revenues and see what that means in terms of, what's the reality of funding that and what kind of revenue levels will that require. Sorry, I've gone a bit over time, but that's all.